Will you just be quiet? Okay, here we go. Okay, so the institution of slavery. Slavery is horrible. We've already read 3 chapters in To Be a Slave about what slavery is and why it's happened and what it was like for slaves. Again, slaves are non-citizens. That means that everything that Americans believed in, everything that they fought for, everything that they wrote down in the Declaration of Independence, in the Constitution, slaves were not given those things because they were not non-citizens. Rights like being able to complain about the government or being treated fairly or being free from torture, having a trial, having a judge, being able to speak out, being able to assemble, being able to hold weapons, all those things, all those ideas that we have in the Bill of Rights and those ideas about being able to choose your own government, those do not belong to slaves because they're not citizens. Hereditary. Slaves inherited their plot in life from their parents. If their parents were slaves, they were going to be a slave. If they were a slave, their children would be slaves. And most likely, generations would be slaves. There was no escaping it. You read about the plantation system. 200 pounds of cotton on most of the plantations that they had to pick. If you picked more, you were expected to pick more. 225 pounds of cotton every single day. If you picked less than your quota, then you'd be whipped. 25 lashes, 50 lashes. 100 lashes is severe. 100 lashes would take off all the skin off of your back. You wouldn't be able to work for months. Their habitation on the plantation, the place where they lived, was horrible. Many said that was not even fit for animals. When it rained, their ground floor would turn into mud. They slept with logs as pillows. There was holes in the walls where the wind would come through and the rain would come through and the snow would come through. They worked from sun up till sundown every day without stop. Hard labor. If they stopped to catch a breath, if they messed up, they were whipped. Runaways. If you ran away, they would catch you. And they enforced everyone to make sure that everyone was a slave catcher. The entire South was responsible for maintaining the system of slavery. That means that you had to report a missing slave. And if you didn't, then you're in big trouble. So if you were a slave, you almost had no hope of running away. They'd catch you. And when they brought you back, they'd make an example out of you. And they'd torture you in front of your family and your friends. Sometimes they'd kill you. This picture right here represents the fight in between the North and the South. Very basically. We can attach some names to it. We can say that the North is represented by this man named Seward. And Seward wanted immediate abolition, which means freeing of all the slaves. The South can be represented by a man named John C. Calhoun, who wanted to maintain people's property and their way of life. And he said that the right to own slaves was a states' rights issue. How did that happen so quickly? Oh, this whipped around. Is that good? Yeah. Yeah, that's good. They said that it was a states' rights issue. That's not working. So there were fights about slavery. Fights specifically in the capital, Washington, D.C., about whether or not slavery would continue to exist. And of course, the Southerners wanted to maintain their way of life, and the Northerners wanted to stop that way of life. This is for the most part. Not every Northerner thought that way. And so what ended up happening was that a man came forth named Henry Clay, and he tried to make sure that both sides stopped fighting. His first compromise or agreement in between the the two groups was the Missouri Compromise, where Maine came in as a free state and Missouri came in as a slave state. And that ended up settling some differences for a while. The reason why that is important is because when the states come in, they also bring in new representatives, new senators, and new representatives for the House. And if you have an unequal balance of people in the capital, then what ends up happening is that one group will win based upon the majority rule, people voting. If you have more people on one side, they're going to win. And so the Missouri Compromise was proposed and the balance was kept. 30 years later, another proposal, another agreement was made called the Compromise of 1850. And he's just trying to make sure that the question of slavery is not answered, but dealt with at a later time. Eventually, of course, it would have to be answered. And many people believe that it would be answered by blood, fighting, people dying. But this was going to postpone that particular day when the bloodshed would arrive. Compromise of 1850 has got 4 parts. Here are 3. First part is that California becomes a free state. That's for the free side, the Northerners. The Texas and Mexican cession is given popular sovereignty, or that's the right to choose whether or not those areas get to have slavery or not. Popular sovereignty means the people rule. The people choose it. The people get to elect whether or not they have slavery. This particular issue is for the Southerners. And the Fugitive Slave Act is passed. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is a very, very harsh slave rule, meaning that if you are a person who sees a runaway slave, you are in charge of making sure that people know the whereabouts of that slave. If you harbor or if you give a person who's escaped from slavery a place to sleep and you feed them, then you're in big trouble. You could be fined, or you could be sent to prison, or both. Everyone had to be in charge of making sure that that property, a slave, was returned back to its rightful owners. The Northerners were not happy about that. And so what ends up happening is the fight in between the North and the South starts to come to a head. And a man emerges named Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln, most people recognize, is a man who does not endorse slavery. He is more of an abolitionist, although not an outspoken abolitionist. And that's what this picture represents. It represents a transformation of Lincoln into being a person who's not very spoken about abolishing slavery into a man who is very spoken about abolishing slavery. At first, he's unsure about whether or not to abolish slavery. And the reason why is because if he comes forth as an abolitionist, then he won't be elected. If he comes forth as an abolitionist, then the Southerners will immediately leave and form their own country based upon slavery. And so he doesn't say that he was going to abolish slavery at first. What ends up happening, though, is that as soon as he's elected, the 7 states do secede. They do leave. They do form their own country called the Confederate States of America. And then Lincoln changes his mind. That's when he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, and he becomes a full-fledged abolitionist. 4 famous speeches, or 4 things that he's famous for. First one is the House Divided speech. In the House Divided speech, he says, "A house divided against itself shall not stand. A nation cannot exist half slave or half free." He says that, and people recognize that he might be an abolitionist, but he warns for the future. And indeed, the nation could not exist half slave or half free. It had to be one thing or the other thing. His second speech is when he becomes president. At his inauguration, the ceremony is called the inauguration. He gives an address, a speech, and he says to the South, he's like, "I fear that you're going to leave. We are not enemies, but we're friends." And he's trying to make sure that the South doesn't leave. He says to them, "We can fix this problem. Don't leave yet." Southerners leave as soon as he's elected. He's elected in November, and then by April, the first state, South Carolina, decides to leave and form its own country. Six other slave states decide to join them, and they form the Confederate States of America, and they elect their president, Jefferson Davis. The third thing that happens after a very famous battle called Antietam. After the slave nation is formed, the Confederate States of America, they start to fight. And after one particular bloody battle in which the Northerners win, Antietam, Abraham Lincoln issues a proclamation, a statement, saying that all the slaves in the southern states are freed. And that's kind of a battle tactic. The fourth thing that he's famous for is the Gettysburg Address. And the Gettysburg Address happens after a famous battle called Gettysburg. At Gettysburg, most historians believe that that's the changing of the tide of the war in favor of the North. The North starts to win that war. It happens in 1863 at the beginning of July. Lincoln comes to Gettysburg after 70,000 casualties to give respect to the people who have died. And he says to the people there in a 2-minute speech, he says, "You must remember the dead and you must honor them because they died for the idea of this nation, the idea of freedom, the idea that all men are created equal. And we must honor them and continue to fight and win this war." And with that 2-minute speech, it rallies the North, and they do win the war. These are some of the facts about the Civil War. The first thing is that when I wrote this down in 2004, that the estimate was 560,000 people. However, there are some estimates now that 750,000 people have died. Thank you. There are some estimates that 750,000 people have died, and that's quite a lot. The war lasted between 1861 through 1865, and there are some famous battles that you should know about. I've already spoken to you about some of them, but you should know that Bull Run is the first major battle, and the significance of Bull Run, and these are questions that you can answer right now. The significance of Bull Run is that it shows the North and the South that the fight will be long and it will be bloody, and no one is sure who will win. I talked about Antietam already, that it was the bloodiest single-day battle. The North won it. Right afterwards, the Emancipation Proclamation was given. I also talked about Gettysburg. Gettysburg turned the tide of the war. It was won on July 4th, 1863. Now the North is winning. One of the last things that I'll talk about is Appomattox. Appomattox is a place near Bull Run where General Lee surrendered, and there was actually no fighting there, but the South agreed to surrender to the North. Then, three battles that indicate the battle plan of the North. The battle plan of the North is to lay siege to the South, which means to surround them and to cut off all their supplies. The first thing that they need to do is they need to control the Mississippi River after they've launched a blockade of ships all the way around the South. So after they control the Mississippi River, it's only a matter of time until the South starts to tap out or give up. So the first battle is Shiloh. That's in the north of the Mississippi River. The second battle is New Orleans. That captures the bottom of the Mississippi River. And then the third battle, the pin, is Vicksburg. And after they defeat Vicksburg, the North, what ends up happening is that it's only a matter of time before the South gives up. Outcomes of the war. The North wins. the South loses, slavery is abolished, and the Union is preserved. We only have one nation now, not two, the United States of America. In this nation, slaves are free, of course, and afterwards, after the fighting is done in 1865, there's a period of time in which they try to rebuild the South, and that's noted by this Band-Aid.